Hello, my name is Adele Tyler, and on behalf of the Nashville Jung Circle, I'm pleased to offer once again this talk on the Red Book, which was originally presented via Zoom in April of 2021. It is the story of a unique book which for almost 100 years has been surrounded by questions and controversy. So to begin, what is the Red Book? Formerly known as Liber Novus, it is a large red leather-bound manuscript created by the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung in the early 1900s. It describes Jung's period of intense introspection, which he called his, quote, confrontation with the unconscious. The text was based on journals of fantasies he had from 1913 to 1916, along with commentary on each fantasy. On the spine, Jung had embossed the title Liber Novus, Latin for new book, but it came to be known as the Red Book. Jung worked on this book from 1914 to 1929, then he put it aside until the 1950s. You will see why it took so long on the next slide. It was never completed or published in his lifetime. When Jung died in 1961, the book was kept by his family. Until it was published in 2009, it was considered one of the most important unpublished works of modern times, creating a mystery about the book. Jung created the book in the style of a medieval manuscript, transcribing the text of the book in calligraphy in an effort to go back in time symbolically, to recapture something he believed he and Western society as a whole had lost, an orientation to the spiritual side of life. Also, he thought it would honor the material to preserve the fantasies in a large, expensive book done in an elaborate style. And this is one reason it took him so many years, because he was doing this transcribing in calligraphy. This sample page also shows Jung's ability as an artist, which I will discuss today. It was a slow process, the calligraphy and the embellishments. In 2009, a facsimile edition of the Red Book was published with the cooperation of Jung's estate. Here's the cover. It contains 189 pages of the calligraphic text in German, and then 53 full-page paintings along with an English translation and introduction. I wish we were together in person for you to examine this book in person. It is large, heavy. It measures about 12 by 15 inches and weighs 10 pounds. So why is the Red Book relevant today? Carl Jung said these experiences recorded in the Red Book were the most important of his life and the basis of all the work he did for the rest of his life for over 40 years. But only in the past 12 years has the book been available to scholars to better understand the basis of Jung's ideas. Also, the book is relevant because of many similarities between the time in which the Red Book was written and our times today. Some people have speculated that the publication of the Red Book almost 100 years from its beginning is itself a synchronicity. Today, I'll tell you the story of how Jung came to create this book and what this unusual book contains, the stories and the art. Then we'll look at how it can be useful today, not only for Jungian scholars, but for anyone interested in personal and spiritual growth. I titled this talk Art and Mystery to highlight that now Jung is being recognized also as an artist. Jung actively resisted seeing his work on the Red Book as art, for he viewed the art itself as secondary to the themes and the concepts he was expressing. But in 2012, the Jung Foundation began a project to assemble the art that he had done through his life and put out this book in 2018. So now we can appreciate his paintings and illustrations as art also. As for the other part of my title, Mystery, it's because there have been so many questions surrounding this book. Why was the book, begun in 1914, not published until 2009, almost 100 years after Jung started it? Did Jung mean for the book to be published? Was it a work of genius or madness? And what happened to the book for 50 years after Jung's death? And why did he say it was the source of all of his later work, theories, and writings? The fact that no one could read this until 2009 did create quite a mystery. So part one, the story of the Red Book. To understand Jung's self-experiment that resulted in the creation of this Red Book, we need a little context. So let's begin the story a few years earlier in the first decade of the 1900s. In 1906, Jung became acquainted with Sigmund Freud, and they worked closely together for a period of approximately 6 years. Here you see a photo of Freud on the far left and Jung on the far right. They were speaking at Clark University in Massachusetts in 1909. Freud and Jung had a father-son relationship, with Freud saying that Jung was his heir apparent. But eventually their differences, particularly about Freud's theories on sexuality and Jung's interest in the occult, led to a final break in the relationship in 1912. This break with Freud leads to a career crisis. At the same time, Europe was on the brink of World War I, which relates directly to Jung's personal crisis and the creation of this book. In fact, his editor, Sanu Samdashani, said that if World War I had not broken out, there would not be a Red Book, something I'll explain as we go on. So the creation of the book and its history from 1913 to 1957. After the painful ending of his relationship with Freud, at age 38, Jung began this midlife crisis. Though he had achieved an international reputation in psychiatry, he lost his standing in his career, felt depressed, disoriented, and unable to continue as a professor and a scientist. Quoting Jung, "I was driven to ask myself, what is the myth you're living?" End quote. So he began a search for his personal myth and cosmology. We might just say that he was very depressed, and then he decided how he would deal with it. So this period that you might call his midlife crisis, some people call a nervous breakdown. We can also call it an intentional self-experiment. It lasted from approximately 1912 to 1917. For at the end of 1912, in December, he began to be flooded by unconscious and disturbing dreams. An expert on schizophrenia, he was worried that he himself was succumbing to one, and some biographers have called this experience a nervous breakdown. But he still called it his, quote, confrontation with the unconscious. Rather than fight the depression and repress these disturbing images, he decides to go into them in an intentional self-experiment. By October 1913, he began having waking visions, not only dreams. He had these waking visions of a great flood, rivers of blood covering Europe, recovering images of dead bodies, floating corpses, Europe covered in ice. A voice tells them that it will all become real. Jung's confrontation with the unconscious. This was a purposeful engagement with his fantasies in a waking state. This picture here shows the ego as the tip of the iceberg, with the unconscious mind occupying a much larger realm below. Rather than repressing or ignoring these fantasies, he decides to confront them directly and record them like a scientist in journals, which we now call the Black Books. He embarked on this self-experiment by devising a method to allow him to sink into his unconscious mind. His routine daily was to continue with his normal activities, seeing patients in his home study, participating in his responsibilities as a father and a husband. And then each evening he would retreat to his study and consciously go into his fantasies using a meditative technique. This technique he later called active imagination. It was a meditation technique that he developed to engage with his unconscious mind. I will read to you what he said about how he did this. In order to seize hold of the fantasies, I frequently imagined a deep descent. I even made several attempts to get to the very bottom. The first time I reached, as it were, a depth of about 1,000 feet. The next time I found myself at the edge of a cosmic abyss. It was like a voyage to the moon or descent into empty space. First came the image of a crater, and I had the feeling I was in the land of the dead. Near the slope of a rock, I caught sight of two figures, an old man with a white beard and a beautiful young girl. So this was from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. It just gives you an example of how he started his active imagination. In explaining active imagination to his patients, who he encouraged to try this, he said, concentrate on a particular mood and allow all fantasies and associations that come up in connection with it, or allow them free play, a free association process. For Jung, doing this led to fantasy encounters with various characters and conversations with them. During the first year of this experiment, though, Jung continued to worry he might be going into a psychosis, but he persevered with the self-experiment, even though he felt great anxiety about it. With the outbreak of World War I in August of 1914, Jung was actually relieved, for he realized that instead of going mad, he had been experiencing premonitions of what was about to occur in Europe. He'd had over 10 months, from October of 1913, up through August of 1914. He'd had 12 separate fantasies he viewed as precognitions. With the outbreak of the war, he realized his fantasies and dreams were not simply personal, but rather pertained to society as a whole, and perhaps that it was important to examine and understand them as well as share these fantasies and experiences. So he conceived of the idea of a book, exploring a correspondence between his fantasies and what was happening in the world. And 2 months after the war started, he began to write the manuscript that became the Red Book, based on the writings in his Black Book journals. Quoting from the Red Book, Jung wrote, "And then the war broke out. This opened my eyes to what I had experienced before, and it gave me the courage to say all of that which I have written in the earlier part of this book." Here's a picture of the original Black Books, where Jung recorded dreams and visions. He recorded these experiences like a scientist recording data. Self-experimentation was common in that day with psychologists and other scientists. Does this sound like madness, which he's been accused of? I think not. Here's another picture of the Black Books, the originals. And keep in mind, these were journals of his self-experimentation, not personal diaries of day-to-day events. He did not record day-to-day happenings or outer events, only his active imaginations together with reflections on those. Now, the Black Books, he actually wrote in these 6 journals from 1913 to 1932, primarily in the early years, 1913 to 1918. Only sporadic entries after that. The Black Books as a set were actually published for the first time in October of 2020. I've got a set of the books myself in February, and I'm still in the process of reading and incorporating all of this new material. For the material that Jung did not include in the Red Book might prove to be of equal interest to the material he did include. Keep in mind that the Black Books go way beyond the Red Book to record experiences up through 1932, whereas the Red Book, the experiences are only 1913 to 1916. So there is much new material for Jungian scholars to study now. So just to recap the difference between the Black Books and the Red Book, so it doesn't get confusing. The main difference is that the Black Books were written for Jung's personal use. They were personal journals, whereas the Red Book is addressed to the public, which has confirmed for most of us that he did intend for it to be published someday. The Red Book contains revised material from the Black Books, where he omitted some personal references. About 50% of the Red Book is taken directly from the Black Books, then another 50% of the Red Book is commentary on the meaning and significance of these fantasies. And once again, the black books cover years 1913 to 1932. There's 6 journals. Whereas the red book is the years 1913 to 1916 only. He later, past 1916, added paintings to the red book, but they do not correspond to the text. Here's a picture of the typed manuscript from 1915 of Liber Novus. It was 1,000 pages that he had typed. This draft contained most of the entries in Black Books 2 through 4, covering a period from November 13 to April 1914, with commentaries. At this time, Jung was rereading Nietzsche's book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So the structure and style of the Red Book has been greatly influenced by this work and also by Dante's Divine Comedy. Actually creating the book. After writing the manuscript and having it typed, sometime in 1915, Jung decided to transcribe this draft in the form of a medieval illuminated manuscript on parchment as a symbolic way to honor a connection to an earlier age, before science and the Age of Reason, both of which he believed had led to a repression of religion and the irrational. Jung saw this repression as directly related to the outbreak of irrationalism in the form of the war. So keep in mind, he's being very influenced by what's happening in the world around him, World War I. He has a large red leather folio with over 600 parchment pages made for this purpose, calling it Liber Novus. He transcribes the paintings in the book and continues to do that from 1916 through the 1920s, and then stops. He resumes work on the book briefly in the 1950s, but did not finish it. So here you see the style of calligraphy in the book. On the next slide here, go back one. Here is a page from a medieval manuscript, the Book of Kells, to show the style that Jung was imitating. So from 1916 to the 1920s, Jung started drawing and doing paintings of mandalas. He adds these and other illustrations to this calligraphic text. The paintings do not match up with the text, but the paintings are discussed in the later Black books. Later on in the 1920s and in 1959, he adds more full-page paintings like these above. You'll see, we'll talk about more art in a minute, but a common element in Jung's visions were serpents and snakes in both his writings and in paintings. The snake here is seen on the left and a serpent in the painting on the right. By the 1920s, he puts the book aside to begin work on other things. He felt the need to put his experiences into a more concrete 3D form and begins to build himself a medieval structure with no running water or electricity. He calls it the Tower at Bollingen. He also begins a 30-year study of alchemy that takes him away from the Red Book project. In 1929, he puts the book aside, realizing it's time to translate his experiences from this confrontation with the unconscious into scientific theories that he can then share with the public. Some of these: active imagination, individuation, the collective unconscious, archetypes, the self, and synchronicity. Also, during these later years, after 1930, he continues to see clients at his home office, travels to study other cultures, lectures in various countries, and writes many books and articles on theories developed from his Red Book years. He occasionally shares the Red Book with patients and friends and discusses the possibility of publishing it, but he was reluctant to be seen as a mystic rather than a scientist. In 1959, Jung returned to transcribing into the Red Book, adding one more painting and an epilogue that breaks off in mid-sentence. 2 years later, in 1961, Jung died, leaving the book unfinished. The family was unsure what to do with it and kept it in a cupboard in the library of his house for many years, then locked it in a bank vault for 30 years, refusing access to anyone, except there is a story that students at the Jung Institute in Zurich were allowed to come to the house once a year and were shown the book, one page. They were not allowed to touch it. This is someone who was a student there told me this story. In the year 2000, after 3 years of negotiating with Jung's heirs, Sanu Shamdasani was hired to edit the book. He added also an extensive introduction and footnotes, which are really terrific. So after almost 10 years of editing and then photographing the original parchment pages, this facsimile version of the book was published to great fanfare. Just a little more about this man, Sanu Shamdasani, who edited both the Black Books and the Red Book. He's a London-based, brilliant author, editor, and professor at the University College of London, who specializes in the history of psychology. He had been approached by Jung's heirs in 1997 about the suitability of the Red Book for publication. They then gave him permission in the year 2000 after 3 years of discussions. And then he worked on this project, writing this lengthy, helpful introduction for over 8 years. And then, as I said, the Red Book finally came out in 2009. In 2012, the Jung Foundation agreed to allow Shamdasani to work on publication of the Black Books, which were just published in 2020. So once again, he spent 8 years on this project and has written another great introduction, which is worth reading alone. When the book came out in 2009, there was a lot of publicity. The New York Times Magazine, Sunday Magazine, had it as a cover story. There was much fanfare at the time of its publication, museum displays of the original and the Black Books in New York and in Los Angeles, at the Library of Congress, and in some major European cities. In recent years, the Red Book has been on display at museums in Zurich, Paris, and other cities in Europe, and I'm actually not sure where it is now. I think it's locked back up. So part 2, the structure and the content. What's inside this book? Jung's original, the one called Liber Novus, has 2 parts. The first called Liber Primus, the way of what is to come. Part 2, Liber Secundus, the images of the erring. This contained the calligraphic versions of the first and second parts, and then he added the epilogue in 1959, and it also contains the paintings. The Red Book, published in 2009, is a facsimile copy. It also contains Liber Primus and Part 2, Liber Secundus, but there is an added third section called Scrutinies. The editor, Shamdasani, found this handwritten part had never been transcribed into calligraphy into the actual Red Book, but it seemed clear to him that it was the continuation and ending that Jung had intended. So it was added to this new edition. This one also includes the epilogue written by Jung in 1959 and the introduction by Shamdasani, and then there is the complete translation of the German calligraphic text and footnotes and paintings. In the opening pages of Liber Primus, to give you a feel for it, it opens with Bible quotes from the book of Isaiah and John, and Jung writes also about what he calls the spirit of the times, which he considers his conscious ego-driven self, and the spirit of the depths, his unconscious, where he feels pulled to reconnect with something he has lost, that he calls his soul. Jung calls out to his soul in the early pages, quote, my soul, where are you? I speak, I call to you. After long years of wandering, I have come to you again. He then begins to write about conversations with the various characters who appear to him in his fantasies. There are standalone stories with various characters. Some, like Elijah and Salome, appear in the Bible. Others, like PHILEMON and IZDURAR, are from mythologies of other cultures. In these fantasies, he meets and dialogues with these characters creating the separate stories in the book. Other characters, just to keep in mind, Siegfried, the hero archetype, who Jung sees as his own ego. Elijah, who then later becomes called PHILEMON, who is a wisdom archetype of the wise old man. IZDURAR, a god figure from mythology. Salome, Jung sees as his soul or anima, and she is a figure from the New Testament. Other characters are the serpents and the dead. So the first character he meets is Siegfried in an early dream where he kills Siegfried. There's Siegfried in the painting here. This character was a well-known hero figure in German literature. Jung says that Siegfried symbolized Jung's ego, ambitious, arrogant, successful. Jung concludes that he's been inflated with the hero archetype, but at the price of losing his soul, so he now must kill Siegfried. One of the first stories and illustrations in the Red Book is where Jung meets the characters he dialogues with. The first, Elijah, who was in the Book of Kings in the Hebrew Bible, a prophet and a miracle worker. Jung says in his commentary that to him Elijah symbolized wisdom, later calls him the archetype of the sage, or the wise old man. And a female figure, Salome, who we find in the book of Mark in the New Testament, a young woman who danced for King Herod and asked for John the Baptist's head on a platter. At the time, the early 1900s, I think it was about 1905, there was a famous and scandalous opera by Strauss called Salome, with the dance of the seven veils, which was like a striptease. Jung said that Salome symbolized the erotic element. He also said these two figures could be personifications of logos, or reason and judgment, with Elijah, the masculine principle, or animus, and eros, love or passion, the feminine principle Jung names anima. PHILEMON is a main character in the book. Earlier, as I said, he was called Elijah, but later he is turned into Philemon. Here's a painting that Jung did of Philemon. The name came from a Greek myth about a couple, Philemon and his wife Baucis, who unknowingly gave hospitality to the gods and were given eternal life as trees side by side. He appeared with the wings of a kingfisher, which was symbolic, since kingfisher birds dive deep into the water. Jung said that Philemon represented a force which was not Jung himself and showed Jung the reality of the psyche, saying, quote, "These are things in the psyche which I do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life," end quote. Psychologically, Philemon represented superior insight, and he served as a guide or guru to Jung. He's the primary character in the third part of the book, Scrutinies. IZDURAR is one of the most important and interesting stories, and perhaps the highlight of the book. IZDURAR is a giant with bull horns who comes from the east, headed west in search of where the sun goes to be reborn. Jung tells him about science, that the earth actually orbits the sun. This information kills the magic that IZDURAR believes, and IZDURAR begins to wither and die. Jung shrinks him to the size of an egg and puts him in his pocket to take him where he can revive him. In this painting, you can barely see, but at the bottom, Jung, the IZDURAR is emerging from the egg. IZDURAR symbolized the gods of old, which have been felled by science in the age of reason, and Jung has found a way to take him inside, where he's reborn as an inner God image. This incubation and rebirth of IZDURAR, shown here in this painting, follows the classic pattern of solar myths, where a god is born from an egg and declares he is the sun. Jung said this renewed God denotes psychologically libido and psychic energy, and a renewed optimistic attitude and possibility for life. Serpents are one of the most painted figures in the book and appear in several stories. Serpents as a symbol of the unconscious, of the dark and lower world. They act as a bridge between the two worlds, the lower world of spirit and the upper world of matter. By traveling on the ground, they are touching the world below and the world above at the same time. Here is a snake in a lair, symbolizing the spiritual, sexual energy buried in the earth or lower regions of the body, the lower chakra. The snake is like a volcano, spewing forth a tree of life. Psychologically, this symbolizes the snake as a bringer of consciousness. Therefore, it represents salvation and transformation, as psychic energy is gained by the conscious mind from the unconscious below. Here's one more painting, 3 serpents intertwined. And as I noted earlier, the paintings that Jung added to the Red Book don't usually correspond to the text, but they are discussed later in the Black Book writings. The dead appear as characters throughout the book. Paranormal events at Jung's home in 1916 convinced him of hauntings. Now keep in mind that death was close at mind at the time Jung was writing the Red Book with all of the carnage of World War I. But in 1916, there are several of these paranormal events at Jung's home which he, his children, and his servants observed. In the following 3 days of the haunting experiences, he wrote 7 sermons to the dead, almost as automatic writing. He published it under an assumed name in 1916, and he gave away copies to friends but never made it available for sale. After he finished this writing, the haunting was over for good. He credited the book, The 7 Sermons to the Dead, as saying they were written by Basilides of Alexandria, a city where the East meets the West. These sermons to the dead were given by PHILEMON. Scrutinies, as I said earlier, was found by the Red Book's editor, and though it wasn't transcribed into the original Red Book, Shamdasani concluded it was meant to be part 3 of this book, and this is where it's included, the 7 Sermons to the Dead. Themes of the book. So the 2 basic or most overall themes would be, in my opinion, first, how Jung regains his soul and overcomes the spiritual alienation of modern man. Remember, the book was created as Jung's response to a midlife crisis. He saw his depression as a sign that focusing on ego achievements for the first half of his life made him lose contact with his deeper self, his soul. And this book tells how he went about refinding the soul. He theorizes later that refinding one's soul is the primary challenge of the second half of life, how to turn focus from ego pursuits and worldly goals to developing and integrating neglected parts of your inner life, your psyche. The second theme here is important because it's seen as an answer to Nietzsche's claim in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that God is dead. Jung experienced a rebirth of the God image within himself and believed that it was available to all who seek God through a process he calls individuation. So he's refuting the idea that God is dead and saying that God can be reborn. Here's a copy of Nietzsche's book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra was also known as Zoroaster. He was an important religious figure in ancient Persia. The Red Book has been called Jung's answer to Nietzsche's claim that God is dead. Jung was also influenced by Dante's Divine Comedy, Goethe's Faust, as well as the Bible, visionary works of William Blake, mythologies of ancient cultures, and popular culture like Strauss's opera Salome. Some other themes in the book would include, first, resolution of the conflict of opposites such as good, evil, inner, outer, masculine, feminine, spirit, matter, thinking, and feeling. Jung thought the uniting of opposites leads to wholeness, and he later develops this into a theory. Another theory is mankind's relationship and duty to the dead. And then also a theme of psychological and historical effects of Christianity. Now I'd like to discuss the Red Book and Jung as an artist, the second half of my title. Jung once said, "When writing down these fantasies, I ask myself, what am I really doing? Certainly this has nothing to do with science, but then what is it?" Whereupon a voice within me said, "It is art." I was astonished. This is from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. The Red Book itself is unquestionably a work of art with the beautiful calligraphy and embellishments in artwork. But Jung was conflicted about his art and resisted being identified as an artist, wanting to be seen as a scientist instead. His lifelong interest in art, though, began in childhood. Here's a drawing from age 10, done in 1885. Here's another painting showing Jung as an artist, done in 1901 at age 26. Jung was much occupied with painting in the early 1900s. In 1902, he studied in Paris for a year and spent much of his time there painting and visiting art museums, and briefly considered art as a career. After choosing medicine as a career, though, he resisted being seen as an artist, wanting to be known only as a scientist. He did help develop the field of art therapy, though. He did various types of visual art. Here we see him stone carving. He also would build with stones in addition to painting and drawing. Here's another photo of Jung working with stone, carving, and a quote, "At any moment in my life when I came up against a blank wall, I painted a picture or hewed stone. Each such experience proved to be a right d'entrée for the ideas and work that followed hard upon it." Jung used his art as an important process and technique in dealing with his anxieties, so this would be the beginning of what we would call art therapy. His art is a mixture of avant-garde elements with classical forms throughout the book. Avant-garde artists in the years before World War I were obsessed with rediscovering the primitive as a reaction to modern industrial society. I think you can see the avant-garde element in this painting, again, of serpents or some sort of snake-like creature. Note much use of color in his paintings. Jung said that color signaled emotion. His styles reflected many cultures, Middle Eastern, Celtic, and this one, the Native American sand painting. Here's a slide, the next one, of a Navajo sand painting. Jung's painting here is similar to Mayan jade masks. We could spend a good bit of time on each one of these because this is a very dynamic painting, I think. Lots going on. But the jade mask here, and then the next slide, here's a Mayan jade mask. The mandalas are the most depicted figures in the Red Book, but they're not mentioned anywhere in the text because he only began drawing and painting these after he had finished the text of the book. In 1916, while serving in the Swiss Army, each morning he would draw one and say that it had a calming effect. He didn't understand it at the time, but he came to see them as symbols of what he called the self, our deepest part and our connection to the divine. He also called them symbols of wholeness. Many of his mandalas are based on the number 4. Here you see 4 sections made by the 4 lines. Just an aside, he did serve in the Swiss Army in something like being in the Army Reserves as a medical doctor. In this slide, you see the Buddhist sand paintings that are mandalas. They were a major influence on Jung's mandalas. Mandala actually means circle. Some of you here in Nashville may have seen the Buddhist sand mandala that were demonstrated at the Frisch Museum a few years ago. So it was fascinating. Let's look at some more of Jung's mandala paintings in the Red Book. So here's one where the circle is quadrated by 4 rivers. Do you see the rivers coming out from the top, bottom, and 2 sides? He says they all are from the same source, and at one point Jung's soul says that PHILEMON is the source of all streams. These 4 represent 4 qualities: breadth, height, depth, and time. Jung wrote often of the number 4 as the number of completion, commenting that the Trinity of Christianity was incomplete and required a 4th female element, Mary or Sophia. This mandala is entitled Realization of the Self. It is one of 3 paintings that Jung published later in another book, anonymously, saying that it was painted by a middle-aged European man, again, not wanting to be recognized as an artist. In this one, 4 figures represent the 4 aspects of personality. If you can see the top, bottom, and 2 sides. The top and bottom, there are 2 males, top representing light and the bottom male dark. And the left and the right, 2 females, the dark, and on the right, the light. Jung's description of this painting is, quote, "In the center is a star, a white light shining in the firmament. In the first circle, there are protoplasmic seeds. In the second, cosmic principles containing the 4 primary colors. In the third and fourth circles, creative forces working inside and outside. At the cardinal points, the masculine and feminine souls divided into light and dark." This one he called Window into Eternity. It was also published later anonymously. This is called a squared mandala. Jung's description of it is, a luminous flower in the center with stars rotating about it. Around the flower, walls with 8 gates. The whole conceived of as a transparent window. The last mandala in the book is called the Golden Castle. There is a well-fortified castle in the middle. It's sort of small, but if you can see that. Jung's description is, this is a mandala, a fortified city with walls, and a moat that surrounds the central castle, whose center is a golden temple. Probably the most famous painting from the book is this one. It shows 2 styles, the avant-garde style at the upper half of the painting, and the lower half a Swiss landscape in the folk art style. These 2 zones are mediated by a yogi in the center, the upper transcendental zone and the lower mundane zone. To the left and the right in the lower landscape, you'll see on the left the rural pastoral, and on the right the industrial side, if you see the factories with the smokestacks. A strong wind is blowing left to right to keep the gritty smoke of modernity away from polluting the traditional pastoral world. You can see the smoke blowing to the right. On the top of the yogi is a mandala of 4 parts, again the number of wholeness to Jung. The last illustration in the book was painted in the 1950s. We see faces arranged around a mandala that radiates outward into skulls. This recalls caricatures that Jung drew as a boy. Jung said of this painting, "Similar caricatures sometimes appear to me before falling asleep, grinning masks that constantly change and move, among them the familiar faces of people who soon afterwards die." Jung left off on his work on this book 46 years after he started it, writing this epilogue in his normal script and stopping in the middle of a sentence. The last word is possibility, sitting alone at the top of the page. And here is the epilogue translated. I will read to you from 1959. I worked on this book for 16 years. My acquaintance with alchemy in 1930 took me away from it. The beginning of the end came in 1928, when Wilhelm sent me the text of The Golden Flower, an alchemical treatise. There, the contents of this book found their way into actuality, and I could no longer continue working on it. To the superficial observer, it will appear like madness. It would also have developed into one had I not been able to absorb the overpowering force of the original experiences. With the help of alchemy, I could finally arrange them into a whole. I always knew that these experiences contained something precious, and therefore I knew of nothing better than to write them down in a, quote, precious, that is to say, costly book, and to paint the images that emerged through reliving it all, as well as I could. I knew how frightfully inadequate this undertaking was, but despite much work and many distractions, I remained true to it, even if another possibility never. And it breaks off there mid-sentence. So why is the Red Book relevant today? Why should we be interested in this? Well, remember that Jung said these experiences of the Red Book years were the most important of his life and the basis of all the work he did for the rest of his life, which was another 40 years. From the branch of psychology that he created, there are thousands of Jungian analysts, Jungian-oriented therapists, sand play therapists, and dream workers throughout the world, and hundreds of Jung societies and study groups like ours around the world. There are 20 volumes of Jung's collected works and writings and lectures, and hundreds, if not over 1,000, books based on Jungian psychology. Also, his influence has been extensive in popular culture. The Star Wars trilogy, Joseph Campbell's work, musicians like David Bowie, Sting, and the biggest pop band in the world today, BTS of South Korea, which has put out 2 albums based on Jung's theories. He also played a role in the creation of Alcoholics Anonymous. So his influence has been vast, but only in the past 12 years has the book which led to all of this work been available to scholars. Let's see, we're on the, go one more slide. Whoop. Do you see this slide?
Sorry, which slide are we supposed to do?
We go back a couple to the one that says the Red Book, Liber Novus.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. So if you are interested in reading this book, I would recommend buying this reader's edition. But I want to say it's not necessary for you to read this book to gain from it. In fact, if you are new to Jungian material, I would recommend that you start with his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is highly readable and is a fascinating story of this interesting man. If you do want to read this book, though, I would recommend buying the Reader's Edition, which came out in 2012 that you see here. There are approximately 30 to 35 fantasies that he retells in this book, and you can read them almost as you would fairy tales or mythology, along with his commentary on each one. If you're especially interested in his art, you might want to invest in the large Facsimile Red Book that came out in 2009. It sells on Amazon for only $197, so that's very expensive. I believe you can actually rent the book for $10 a week. Or, an alternative, you could buy this book, which came out about 2 years ago, and it contains most of the paintings from the Red Book, along with other art by Jung. As I said earlier, the book is relevant for our time because of similarities between the time at which it was written, the outbreak and throughout World War I, and the time it was published in 2009. Both of these have been times of rapid change technologically, political disruption worldwide, uncertainty about the future, and times of angst. And I would say this is even more true today than when it came out in 2009. So some have speculated that the book came out at this time because it is needed. In conclusion, Jung explored the dark side of culture as well as the spiritual traditions around the world, and he concluded that Christianity and other institutional religion had lost its power to heal. It is now harder to accept a set of beliefs from outside of oneself. The task now is to find one's own connection to the divine within, experience of the God inside in place of belief. So how could the Red Book be a guide for us? I see it as a model of separating oneself from the spirit of the times to listen to the spirit of the depths, i.e., the value of spending time turning inward and honoring one's creative urges. It's a model of the active imagination technique, how you might work with your dreams and conscious fantasies in dialogue with an inner voice. And it is also an example or model of using art as therapy, painting, sculpting, sand play, as well as dance, music, writing. What I hope you'll take away from this talk today is that we can all turn inward to listen to the spirit of the depths. I learned a technique of active imagination at a Jungian conference many years ago, where I dialogued with my inner voice by writing questions with my right hand or dominant hand, then trying to write the answers from an inner voice using my left hand or my non-dominant hand. It was a very enlightening experiment. Others might draw or paint these experiences instead of writing. An excellent book for any of you interested in active imagination is called Inner Work by Robert Johnson. He also recommends working with someone trained in this work or in dream work while you're doing this, because you might uncover some things that you need some help digesting. So I believe I said earlier, but the goal of development is individuation, and this is considered Jung's most important theory. Individuation was seen as the highest goal of personal development. To put it in simple words, it's where we reach our potential and become the person we were born to be. There was a book by James Hillman a few years back called The Soul's Code, where he equates the acorn to the way we are born as an acorn that knows to become an oak tree. So we are born with some sort of potential, and our job in individuating is to uncover that. Spending time to connect with our inner selves through meditation, journaling, art, music, in nature, all are acts of reflection which can help us become more conscious. By understanding what haunts us, our personal collective shadow, complexes, archetypes that we are living out as characters in our own story, by understanding all of these things, we can begin to integrate and balance our conscious and unconscious selves, leading us to healing and wholeness. Finding our center, which Jung called the self, will lead us to experience the divine spark of life from within and help us toward our individuation. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you'll find this introduction to the Red Book helpful for you going forward.